The original cover art of The Lord of the Rings: The Third Age immediately set the stage. The Balrog looms behind Gandalf and a trio of unknown heroes, hinting at an epic adventure both familiar and new. This game was released in 2004 for the PlayStation 2 and also on Xbox and GameCube, plus there was a GBA version as well. Third Age is a turn-based role-playing game set in the world of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy. The Third Age is a bit of an oddity. It's not adapting Tolkien's novel directly, but instead follows the events of the movies from a different perspective. It's a side story of a what-if scenario running parallel to Frodo's quest. When I first encountered it, I was in the middle school, a time when the Lord of the Rings films were the coolest thing on the planet for me and my friends. I vividly remember the first time I played it. It was at a friend's house after school. We fired up his PlayStation 2 and loaded the game, not entirely sure what to expect. Almost immediately, we were blown away. One of the earliest big encounters in the game is with the Balrog in the mines of Moria. Yes, the very same demon of shadow and flame that Gandalf fights in the Fellowship of the Ring. Seeing that battle rendered on PS2, with Gandalf shouting and the Balrog towering over our characters, it was jaw-dropping. We were glued to the screen as the iconic scene played out, except now we were part of it. Later in the game, there is a fight against a Mumakil, an Oliphant, on Pelennor Fields during the big battle outside Minas Tirith. At the time, the sheer scale of that creature and the chaos of battle around it felt unbelievable. It was one of those formative gaming moments that stick with you. Fast forward to today. I recently decided to replay the Third Age. It had been many years, and I'll admit that I was a little nervous. Sometimes revisiting something you loved as a kid can be risky. What if it's not as good as you remember? What if it's hopelessly dated? To give the game the best chance to shine, I went the extra mile. I played it on emulator with fan-made HD texture packs and even a patch to run at 60 FPS. The community has put effort into upscaling the game old textures, and seeing it in high resolution on a modern display was fantastic. I've played it on Odin 2 handheld, and the experience was amazing. I'm happy to report that Third Age holds up surprisingly well. Of course, some aspects are dated, we'll talk about those, but by large I found myself falling right back in love with the game. The strategic combat, the sweeping soundtrack, the nostalgic PS2 era graphics, it all came rushing back. In this video, I want to break down the Third Age from both a nostalgic and a critical perspective. I will be exploring how and why this unique game was made, how it connects to Tolkien's world, its story, or lack thereof in some cases, the gameplay systems, the audiovisual presentation, and the themes and atmosphere that make it special. I will also discuss how the game was received when it came out and what legacy it has today, over 20 years later. This is going to be a full deep dive retrospective, a reflective journey through Middle-earth as seen by the game. Along the way, I'll share personal memories and how my perception of the game has changed from middle school days to now. So grab a seat and let's embark on this retrospective adventure. Whether you played Third Age back in the day, or you're just curious about this odd Lord of the Rings RPG, I invite you to come with me. Let's start at the beginning. Who made this game and why was it such an unusual project for its time? To understand the Third Age, it helps to know who was behind it and what the gaming landscape looked like in the early 2000s. The game was developed by EA Redwood Shores, the studio that would later be known as Visceral Games. Yes, that's the same team famous for the Dead Space series. In 2004, Redwood Shores was one of Electronic Arts' internal studios, and at the time they were best known for working on licensed games. In fact, the core team on the Third Age had just finished making EA's action game, The Return of the King, which was a slasher title directly based on the third Lord of the Rings film. Game was quite popular and did a great job of letting players relive the movie's big battles by mashing buttons and slicing through orcs. So it came as a bit of a surprise that EA's next Lord of the Rings project wasn't another action game or something straightforward. Instead, it was a turn-based RPG. That was not a typical move for EA at the time, especially on consoles. Why did EA and Redwood Shores venture into turn-based RPG territory? It seems to be a combination of timing, talent, and the sheer popularity of Lord of the Rings. By 2004, the film trilogy has concluded with a bang. The Return of the King swept Oscars in early 2004, and the fandom was at its peak. EA had the rights to make games based on movies, and they'd already done action games and even real-time strategy on PC. An RPG was a way to tap into a different part of the market, the more story-driven, slow-paced side of gaming, and to give fans a new way to experience Middle-earth. According to Steve Gray, the executive producer of the Third Age, an RPG set in Lord of the Rings was a game he'd personally wanted to make for a long time. Steve Gray had an interesting background. He worked at Square on RPGs like Parasite Eve and had some involvement with the Final Fantasy series. So, within Redwood Shores, there was a champion for the idea of a Lord of the Rings RPG. Once the team had finished Return of the King in the late 2003, they essentially said, "We have all these assets and the movie rights. Let's finally do the Middle-earth RPG that we've been dreaming about." EA gave the green light, perhaps seeing how successful RPGs were in that era. Final Fantasy X, Kingdom Hearts, and similar games were big on consoles, and Western RPGs like Knights of the Old Republic were proving popular too. It was indeed unusual for EA, a company known for sports games, racing games, and big mainstream titles, to produce a traditional turn-based JRPG style game. But the context helped. This was the early 2000s, when turn-based RPGs were still fairly mainstream, and the Lord of the Rings license virtually guaranteed interest. Plus, EA Redwood Shores had basically maxed out the slasher approach with the previous games. An RPG allowed them to showcase the breadth of the film's story in a new way. They could include more locations, more characters, and more of the narrative than a pure action game could. Another reason EA might have pursued an RPG is the longevity and depth that the genre offers. A turn-based RPGs can deliver a 30+ hours experience covering all three films, where an action game tends to be much shorter and focused on set pieces. With the Third Age, EA could attract the hardcore Lord of the Rings fans who wanted to sink time into Middle-earth beyond just quick beat 'em up. It was a chance to create something like playable companion to the entire trilogy. Ambitious, to say the least. Let's talk a bit about the people behind it. I mentioned Steve Gray, who was the executive producer. He was essentially the driving force and public face in interviews. The lead designer was Chris Tremel, and the producer was Todd Arnold. Though these names might not mean much to the average player, these folks had cut their teeth on other EA projects. Redwood Shore was a diverse team, and interestingly, they weren't RPG specialists. They were learning and borrowing from the best. In Gray's words, the Third Age combat would feel familiar if you played Final Fantasy. In fact, the influence of Final Fantasy X is unmistakable. More on that when we discuss gameplay. To build this game, Redwood Shores used every asset they could from the films. They worked closely with New Line Cinema, the film studio, to get access to costumes, concept art, and even the film score. They also got some of the actors on board for voice work or reused voice lines. Sir Ian McKellen reprised Gandalf in a limited capacity, narrating certain scenes, and they had the booming voice of Sir Christopher Lee return as Saruman in some narrated interludes later on. This level of involvement from the film's talent was a huge selling point. It made the game feel like an extension of the movies. From a business standpoint, EA likely saw the Third Age as a culmination of the Lord of the Rings efforts. It hit consoles in November 2004, about a year after the last film, riding that wave of fan enthusiasm. The game was multi-platform and even had a separate Game Boy Advance version to cover all bases. Despite all of this, EA never made a sequel to the Third Age. Redwood Shores would move to other projects. They did From Russia with Love, the James Bond game, the Godfather game, and eventually hit it big with Dead Space in 2008. The Lord of the Rings license itself moved around. A few years later, Warner Bros. Would acquire rights for the new Lord of the Rings games, effectively ending EA's run. So the Third Age remains a one-off experiment. But it was a bold experiment. A big budget, movie-based, turn-based RPG, at a time when that was almost unheard of from a Western studio. In summary, the Third Age was made up by passionate team at EA Redwood Shores who loved Lord of the Rings and saw an opportunity to create a Final Fantasy in Middle-earth. It was greenlit in an afterglow of the film's success, and it leveraged every bit of the film lore and assets available. It's time now to see how they connected this game's story to Tolkien's world, because they had a very interesting tightrope to walk, sticking to Peter Jackson's film canon while introducing a completely new set of heroes. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Third Age is how it weaves itself into the familiar events of The Lord of the Rings without being officially part of the canon. The game's story runs parallel to the journey of the Fellowship, meaning all the big events of the film trilogy are happening, and your characters are following right behind. It's almost like a Forrest Gump situation in Middle-earth. Your heroes show up at famous moments and places, influencing things in small and sometimes not so small ways, yet the Fellowship and the Ring remain the central driving forces of the war. First, let's clarify the right issue that shaped the game's content. EA's license was to make games based on the New Line Cinema films, not directly on Tolkien novels. Meanwhile, another company, Vivendi, held rights to make games from the literary source. This means the Third Age could use anything depicted in Peter Jackson movies, like dialogues, costumes, the look of characters, etc., but it couldn't go wander off into purely book-only territories. For example, you won't find Tom Bombadil in this game, because he was never in the film. On the flip side, the game developers did have freedom to invent original characters and side stories, as long as they didn't contradict the films. So the Third Age exists in this odd space. It's like fan fiction set in the movie universe, where the writers said, okay, what if there was another Fellowship of the Heroes who were always one step behind the main Fellowship of the Ring? Your player control party is indeed often jokingly called the Fellowship B Team or the Second Fellowship. They are all original characters, but many are clearly modeled after archetypes from the primary story. The party includes Beretor, a Gondorian captain akin to a Boromir/Aragorn type of human hero, Idrial, an elf woman of Lothlorien, which immediately draws parallels to characters like Arwen or Legolas in terms of having an elf in the mix. Elegost, a Dunedain ranger, very much evoking Aragorn's ranger aspect. Hadhod, who is a dwarf, who is basically our stand-in for Gimli's role. Morwen, a shield maiden of Rohan, similar in vibe to Eowyn or a hardy Rohirrim warrior, but a commoner. And Eoden, a knight of Rohan Royal's Guard, another Rohirrim perspective. Notably, there are no hobbits in your crew, perhaps because having tiny hobbits running around might have complicated the game's combat mechanics, or maybe because they wanted this to feel like a somewhat more mature war party. It's a party that is almost comically similar in composition to the real Fellowship, just missing a wizard and some halflings. Now, how does the game insert these characters into Middle-earth saga? The story kicks off just before the Fellowship of the Ring really gets going. Beretor, our main protagonist, is traveling toward Rivendell in search of his friend and liege Boromir. So right away, the game ties him to a known character, Boromir, the son of Beretor, who we know joins the Fellowship. The idea that Boromir left Gondor in a hurry after having the prophetic dream about the ring, and Beretor, as a loyal captain, is trying to catch up him to assist. This is a clever setup because it justifies a new character moving through the world at the same time as the Fellowship. On the road to Rivendell, Beretor gets attacked by the Nazgul and is saved in the nick of time by Idrial, the elf maiden. Idrial is introduced as a servant of Galadriel, which gives her some gravitas, Galadriel being a powerful elf leader in Lothlorien. With the Nazgul driven off by Idrial magic, Beretor and Idrial form an alliance. They soon encounter Gandalf, or rather Gandalf communicates with them. A very important narrative device in the Third Age is that Gandalf essentially guides your party from afar. Throughout the game, you will find or receive epic scenes, which are film clips narrated by Gandalf, giving context or instructions. It's as if Gandalf had a telepathic hotline to Beretor, nudging this secondary fellowship to go where they needed. In one of these early scenes, Gandalf basically tasks Beretor and Idrial to follow the fellowship's path. Not directly with them, but behind them, and to help where needed. It's implied that Gandalf considers this group a kind of backup plan in case Frodo and Aragorn efforts fail. This concept of fate and others playing their role is very much in line with Tolkienian themes, even if the specifics are non-canonical. So Gandalf's guidance sets your party on the trail of the Fellowship. What follows is almost a Middle-earth road trip that hits all the famous locales from the trilogy. You travel through the mines of Moria, hot on the heels of the Fellowship. In fact, your party is in Moria at the same time, just a little behind. There is a moment where you literally see the aftermath of Pippin knocking a skeleton down a well. The skeleton falls in front of you. The game has fun with these little overlaps. Eventually, in Moria's depth, you catch up just enough to arrive at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, when Gandalf is facing the Barlock. And yes, the Third Age makes the bold and kind of absurd choice to have your party join Gandalf in fighting the Barlock of Moria. In the film and the book, Gandalf faces that horror alone to let the others escape, but in the game, our heroes gets a piece of action. You actually help Gandalf weaken the Barlock in a boss battle. Ultimately, Gandalf still delivers the finishing blow, "You shall not pass" and all, and falls into the abyss, because the main story can't be changed. Your party couldn't save him from that fate, but the idea is they helped him achieve victory. It's a thrilling set piece. As a player, you're awash in fan service, battling side by side with Gandalf and hearing the epic Howard Shore score. Lore purists might roll their eyes, but as a fan, it's hard not to grin at that moment. After Moria, your team exits on the other side, near Lothlorien. The Fellowship by then has gone down the river, but Gandalf continues to telepathically narrate events to you via those film clip scenes. Your party presses on southward. In Rohan, there is original side sequence in a village where the game throws you in a confrontation with Grima Wormtongue. Now, Wormtongue in the films is always in Edoras scheming until Gandalf outs him, and he never has a direct physical conflict. But in a Third Age, apparently the writers thought, we need another boss fight. Let's have the party fight Wormtongue and some minions on the side. It's one of those non-canon events that doesn't really affect the film's plot. It's a bit of creative liberty that adds context for the game's sake. The big set piece for Two Towers portion of the game is Helm's Deep. By the time you reach Helm's Deep, your party also picks up Morwen, the Rohan woman who wants revenge for her village being burned by orcs, and Eoden, one of Theoden's royal guard who presumably survived some battles and join you. At Helm's Deep, the Third Age really leans into mirroring a key scene. You actively fight alongside Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli to defend the fortress. The game basically recreates the siege of Helm's Deep, and while the main heroes are doing their thing, like Aragorn tossing Gimli or fighting on the wall, your heroes are in the thick of it as well, slaying Uruk-hai. It's a lengthy battle sequence spread over multiple encounters. Again, according to the story, one imagines that in the movie timeline there were other pockets of fighting at Helm's Deep and our heroes were there. It stretches plausibility, but it's undeniably cool to partake in that battle. Moving into the Return of the King era, the party goes to Osgiliath and Minas Tirith in Gondor. In Osgiliath, you actually help Faramir and fight the leader of Sauron orcs, Gothmog, that disfigured orc general from the movie. You also fend off a bunch of Nazgul in Osgiliath. By the time of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the big battle outside Minas Tirith, your party is present there too. One particularly striking, if lore-breaking intervention, is that you assist Eowyn in the fight against the Witch King of Angmar. In the film, Eowyn and Merry famously take down the Witch King. In the game, it appears the Witch King is a boss you and Eowyn fight together. In any case, your party contributes to felling the Witch King. For a fan, this is bittersweet. On one hand, you get satisfaction of battling the greatest of the Nazgul. On the other hand, it kinds of steals thunder from what is Eowyn's big hero moment in the story. But the game tries not to contradict the outcome. Eowyn still strikes the final blow. Now, one of the weirdest original twists the game throws at you. After the victory at Pelennor Fields, the remaining Nazgul kidnap Morwen, your Rohan companion. This doesn't happen anywhere in the books or films, obviously. It's purely a device to give your party personal stake and an extra quest. So you and the others go and rescue Morwen. By this point, the game is basically wrapping up all major battles. The Pelennor battle is won, Aragorn is around, the ring is on its way to Mount Doom, unbeknownst to your party. You might think the game would end with, say, the Blackgate battle, where Aragorn leads the remaining forces as a diversion, but the Third Age has something far less expected in mind for its finale. After all those adventures, your party suddenly finds itself transported to the very top of Barad-dûr, Sauron's Dark Tower in Mordor. Don't ask how, it just happens. The game literally doesn't explain it. One moment you are in some distance from Blackgate, the next, a cutscene puts you at Barad-dûr, as if by Eagle Airlines or something. There, you face the final boss, the Eye of Sauron itself. Yes, you actually fight the Eye. This is, of course, completely absurd from a story standpoint. In Tolkien's lore, Sauron Eye isn't something you can just duel with a sword. It's a metaphysical presence atop of the tower. And the only victory over Sauron comes from destroying the ring. But the Third Age throws cannon to the wind here for sake of giving players a climatic boss fight. The Eye of Sauron is portrayed kind of like a big flaming entity that you have to attack while it presumably lashes out with dark magic. It's a tough fight, and beating Sauron's Eye doesn't kill Sauron per se. The game sort of times it such that the ring is destroyed shortly afterward in the narrative. But the fact remains, the game ends with your party physically battling the embodiment of Sauron. It's wild, it's completely non-canonical, and it's, dare I say, strangely satisfying. Part of me remembers defeating the Eye of Sauron and thinking, that was both awesome and kind of dumb, but I loved it. And I'm clearly not alone, as retrospectives also described that final battle as both awesome and dumb as well. It's the game giving you a final catharsis that the movies never could. You get to essentially vanquish the Dark Lord in combat, something only possible in video game scenario like this. So, in connecting to Tolkien's world, the Third Age does a constant dance of mirroring iconic scenes and adding new side events. It tries to have its cake and eat it too. You see Gandalf versus Balrog, Eowyn versus Witch King, etc., and you have extra battles like fighting orc captains, trolls, or Grima that were never in the film. The plot is not deep on its own. It heavily relies on the film's plot for structure. You essentially chase the war across Middle-earth from Moria to Mordor. And because it's not official part of Tolkien's legendarium, you have to accept it as its kind of what-if fantasy. There is no attempt to reconcile how exactly your party deeds fit the canon. Once you finish the game, you're left to assume they just quietly helped from the shadows and faded away. One could criticize that the game additions sometimes break immersion or coherence. For example, how did your party get to the top of Barad-dûr without being noticed? And how did they survive poking Sauron's eye? The game doesn't say, it's simply a grand finale. Or how could you realistically have been at all these battles without any mention in the lore? If you demand strict logic, it's not going to hold up. However, as a fan service vehicle, the Third Age excels. It allows a fan to step into nearly every big moment of the trilogy. The absurd moments, like fighting alongside heroes who never mentioned you, or battling metaphysical evil directly, can indeed jolt you out of the lore for the second. I remember at times smirking and thinking, okay, sure, we're doing this now, especially during the Eye of Sauron fight. The game does try to integrate themes of fate and providence, which are very Tolkienian, through this side story. Gandalf's guiding hand implies that perhaps it was meant to be that these unsung heroes fight in the background. In a way, it emphasizes a theme that no matter how grand the primary heroes are, others also play their part in the battle against evil. That's a theme you can find in Tolkien's world. Think of many unnamed soldiers and allies in the War of the Ring. The Third Age just takes it to extreme by personifying those others as a heroic party that we get to control. In conclusion for this section, the Third Age connects to Tolkien's world by closely shadowing the film's trilogy narrative, to the point of overlap and occasional contradiction. It's not part of the official canon, and it doesn't pretend to be. Instead, it unabashedly offers a greatest hits tour of Middle-earth battles from a new perspective. If you can suspend your disbelief and just roll with the idea of Second Fellowship roaming around, the way the game ties into the events of Lord of the Rings is actually very entertaining. It's like watching the movies with a bonus commentary track, except the commentary track is interactive and involves you slaying some extra orcs on the side. Now that we understand where and when this game takes place in Middle-earth, let's talk about how the story is structured and presented, and how those new original characters fare in terms of narrative. Because while the connection to Lord of the Rings is a selling point, the Third Age has often been critiqued for its story and character development. It's time to examine that in detail. If you were to describe the story of Third Age in one line, you might say, a band of original characters following the Fellowship's trail through the War of the Ring, helping from the sidelines. And that's pretty much it. There isn't a deeply intricate original plot. It's more like a guided tour of a movie plot with commentary. The developers themselves admitted they weren't trying to second guess or rewrite Tolkien's story. Instead, they wanted to show more of Peter Jackson's Middle-earth, letting you experience famous events from a different angle. Let's break down how the story is structured in the game. The game is divided into chapters that correspond to locations: Moria, Rohan, Helm's Deep, and so on. And each chapter generally aligns with part of the film trilogy timeline. As you progress, you trigger cutscenes either rendered in-game or using actual film footage. Many of these are the epic scenes I mentioned, where you unlock clips from the movies with Gandalf narrating. These scenes serve two purposes. They provide backstory and exposition. Often Gandalf will describe what the Fellowship or the enemy is doing at the time. And they motivate your characters to move to the next objective. In a sense, Gandalf's voice is saying, meanwhile, this and this is happening, so you should probably go there next. One critique that emerged, even in reviews back in 2004, is that the game relies too heavily on those clips and Gandalf's narration, rather than developing its own characters through storytelling. As GameSpot review put it, there is so much exposition being done by Gandalf that it seems to come at the expense of your characters, leaving the player feeling a bit distant from the new heroes. I felt this even during my recent replay. After a big battle or upon entering a new area, I would be often treated to montage of scenes from the movie, say the Ents attacking Isengard or Frodo's struggle in Shelob's lair, with Gandalf intoning wise words over it. While it's awesome to see Sir Ian McKellen, or at least hear him, delivering new lines as Gandalf, sometimes the connection to your party immediate situation is tenuous. It can feel like you're watching the DVD appendices rather than living the story through your characters. The original characters themselves, Beretor, Idrial, Elegost, Hathot, Morwen and Eoden, are, to put it kindly, archetypal. They have just enough backstory to explain why they are adventuring, but not much more. For example, Beretor is noble Gondorian warrior seeking redemption. We later learn that he was banished for fleeing a battle, a hint to a character flaw. He's brave and duty-bound, very much the stock hero. Idrial is the wise and somewhat melancholic elf who provides counsel and healing. She's almost a proxy for characters like Arwen or Galadriel, even sacrificing something of herself at some point. It's mentioned she gives up her immortality to save Beretor, paralleling Arwen's choice for Aragorn, though in game terms it doesn't affect the mechanics, it's just a lore tidbit. Elegost is a ranger from the north, an old friend of Beretor apparently, who has the quiet, worldly hunter vibe, much like Aragorn ranger persona but without the kingly destiny. Hathot is a gruff, axe-wielding dwarf who often comments about mines, gold and battle, very much channeling Gimli stereotype. He even has an ongoing banter with Elegost, somewhat reminiscent of the Legolas Gimli dynamic, though not as fleshed out. Morwen is interesting in concept, a common woman of Rohan who lost her family to orcs, giving a civilian's perspective to the war. But once she joins, her personal story doesn't progress much beyond I fight so that no one else suffer what I did. Eoden is a late joiner with even less development, essentially a loyal soldier of Rohan who comes along after Helm's Deep, filling out the combat roster with spear skills. Between battles, the characters do have a bit of dialogue. They chat about mission or react to things. For example, Hathot might express awe in Moria, Idrial might speak sorrowfully about the fading elves, and so on. These moments are there, but they are quite brief and infrequent. There is no branching narrative or player choice in dialogue. It's a linear story. The game's primary focus is not on plot twists or complex character arcs, but rather on fanservice moments. And by fanservice I mean those, oh wow, is that scene from the movie moments. We've talked about many of them, like fighting the Barlock or defending Helm's Deep. Each time one of these happens, it's undeniably exciting if you love the source material. I personally found myself grinning during the Helm's Deep segment, when the game essentially recreates the cinematic shots. Horn blasting, ladder up the walls, and then you're suddenly in combat with orcs swarming you. The music swells exactly as in the film. It's effective nostalgia. However, this approach does come at the cost of narrative cohesion. The story of Third Age can feel like it's jumping from a set piece to a set piece, with the connective tissue being Gandalf narrated summaries. As a result, you don't get a traditional rising and falling action centered on the new characters. Instead, the emotional high points are borrowed from the films. You're effectively riding the emotional roller coaster of the Lord of the Rings films: Moria, Awe and Terror, Rohan Despair, Gondor Desperate Fight, and so on, rather than the original roller coaster built around these characters. In a sense, Beretor and friends are passengers in their own story. Is that a bad thing? It depends of what you came for. As a teenage Lord of the Rings fanatic, I loved that the game was basically a supercut of trilogy with extra battles. I didn't care that Beretor was a bit bland. I was projecting my own excitement onto him. But replaying it now, I do notice how little I learned about these characters by the end. There are attempts at character moments. For instance, there is a hinted romance subplot. Beretor has an implied attraction to Idrial initially. She's his radiant elven rescuer after all. But later Morwen is introduced and they shift to suggesting Beretor and Morwen pair up. It's all very lightly touched upon in dialogue and ending, without really building it up. That particular aspect feels a bit forced and undercooked. Another subplot, revealed towards the end, involves Beretor past. It turns out that Saruman had encountered Beretor and subtly enchanted him, through a wound from a Morgul blade, to make him an unwitting agent. Saruman's plan was that if Boromir took the ring at the Council of Elrond, Beretor, being Boromir's comrade, would be compelled to seize it for Saruman. This is quite an intriguing twist. It's like Beretor was a sleeper agent who never got activated because Boromir didn't end up with the ring. The game reveals this late, and it explains Beretor's banishment. He fled a prior battle due to the Witch King influence and a wound. Ultimately, Beretor overcomes this influence, especially after helping defeat Saruman forces. But this plot point is resolved almost as soon as it's revealed, so it doesn't have a huge impact on the journey you've played. It's more like a backstory trivia that could have been much more. It had potential for drama, but the Third Age doesn't really go there. It stays very safe. Your party members all get along, and no one ever truly falters in loyalty. So, what we have is a story structure that is linear and tied to traveling from one famous battle to next. It's less of a character-driven narrative and more of an experiential narrative. By experiential, I mean the game is structured to let you experience Middle-earth war rather than deeply explore the inner lives of the protagonists. In many ways, the Third Age is like a guided museum tour of the Lord of the Rings movie highlights, with Beretor and company as your tour group. Gandalf is the tour guide chiming in with the lore. Depending on your expectations, that can either be delightful or a bit disappointing. From a pacing perspective, the heavy use of film clips can either enhance or detract. Sometimes it's also motivation. After a tough series of battles, you unlock a beautifully edited montage. Other times, I felt like, okay, let's get back to my story now. Especially if I had just watched something I already knew from the films. This was especially true on replay. Now that I really know the films by heart, seeing the clips felt less novel than it did in 2004, when I might not have memorized every extended edition scene. There is also the aspect of side quest or optional content in the story structure. The game does offer a few side objectives in each area, like finding certain lore items or legendary weapons. This usually triggers a snippet of Gandalf narration too, often extra bits of Middle-earth lore. For example, you might find a lost manuscript in Moria, and Gandalf voiceover will talk about Mithril or Durin's folk. This doesn't affect the main narrative, but they enrich the world and reward exploration. I appreciated those touches, as they make the game feel a bit more than just straight corridors. You get some Tolkien lore as treat for poking around. To sum up the story and structure, the Third Age narrative is more piggyback than original. It's mostly linear march through the events of the Lord of the Rings films, with minimal deviation. The original character exists to give the players a lens through which to participate, but they themselves are not very fleshed out. This led to mixed feelings among players. Critics at the time noted they never really care if the new characters lived or died, and it's true. The game doesn't invest in deep character development that would make you emotionally attached to Beretor's personal journey, for example. The emotional attachment you're likely to feel comes from your love of Lord of the Rings as a whole. The music swells, you recall the emotion of the film scenes, and that washes over into your gameplay experience. From my personal perspective, revisiting the game in 2025, I found myself nostalgic for that very reason. The story of Third Age is the story of me remembering how I felt watching and reading Lord of the Rings. It's like the game is a conduit to those feelings. In contrast, when I replay an original story-driven RPG, like Final Fantasy for instance, I'm recalling that game's own narrative and characters primarily. With the Third Age, I'm recalling Tolkien's narrative. It's an interesting synergy and maybe exactly what EA was aiming for, a complementary experience rather than standalone epic. In closing this section, if you are looking for a rich standalone story, the Third Age might underwhelm you. But if you view it as a companion piece to the Lord of the Rings film, it can be very rewarding. It's a commentary or a very elaborate piece of fan fiction that says, what if you were there too? The phrase commentary track to the main trilogy that we used earlier is apt. It really does feel like that. And like any commentary, it sometimes veers off or repeats what you already know, but also sometimes provides a cool new insight or angle. Alright, with the narrative backdrop covered, the next big question is, how does the game actually play? We've compared it to Final Fantasy X a few times, and indeed gameplay is where the Third Age truly wears its inspiration on its sleeve. Let's dive into the combat mechanics and all those gameplay details. The stuff that either keeps you hooked for 30 hours or make it feel like a grind. When I first played the Third Age, it immediately felt familiar. Almost too familiar in its gameplay. That's because the combat system is heavily inspired by Japanese RPGs, particularly Final Fantasy X. If you played Final Fantasy X, you will recall the conditional turn-based system with a visible turn order bar. The third age basically lifts that system and plugs it into the Middle Earth. On the screen during battles, you will see a queue that shows which characters, ally or enemy, will act in what order, and this order can be manipulated by using spells or abilities that cause delays, stuns, or speed buffs. Time pauses while you choose your moves. It's thoughtful, turn-by-turn affair where strategy can trump reflexes. This was quite a departure for an EA game. It wasn't action combat, it was more like chess with orcs. And I loved it. The pacing allowed me to soak in the cool animations and consider my tactics. Each character in your party has a set unique skills and roles, which made team composition important and fun to experiment with. Let's break down the basics. You have 3 active characters on the field at a time. However, you're typically free to swap characters in and out mid-battle on your turn, which is a great feature since it encourages using the whole roster strategically. For example, if I started battle with Beretor, Idrial and Hadhod, but then an enemy that's best handled by Elegost archery shows up, I can swap Elegost in and maybe bench Hadhod for a bit. There is a few cinematic battles where a 4th guest character, like Gandalf or Aragorn, temporarily fights alongside you, but these moments are scripted and brief. Each hero has multiple skill trees or categories. Typically, there is one corresponding to their weapon, for example Beretor's sword techniques, Elegost bow skills, Hadhod axe or hammer attacks. One of some kind of magic or special ability. Idrial has healing spirit powers, Hadhod has offensive spirit powers like fire spells, etc. And often one for passive buffs or miscellaneous abilities. For instance, Beretor has a leadership skill set where he grants party-wide buffs, while Morven has thief skills involving dual wielding and stealing items from enemies. To learn new abilities, the third age uses a use-based progression system. The more you use a particular skill type, the more skills in that tree you can unlock. For example, if Beretor has a sword attack called Ectelion Rat, and he needs to perform it X number of times to unlock the next sword attack, you might end up spamming it a bit to master it. It adds a light grind element. I recall purposefully dragging out easy fights just to get more uses of a skill in, chasing that next unlock. Upon leveling up, you get to allocate points into attributes: strength, spirit, constitution, speed, dexterity. This allows some customization, though they are fairly obvious paths. For example, Idrial, being a primarily healer mage, benefits most from spirit for spell power and speed to act faster, where Beretor benefits from strength for melee damage and constitution for health and defense. You can do quirky builds, like making your dwarf Hadhod super fast at the cost of some strength, if you want a lot of turns, but generally the optimal choices are clear. I found during replay that dumping points into certain stats could trivialize parts of the game. A known optimal path is to crank up Beretor's speed, so he can buff the party quickly and often, or to pump Idrial's spirit, so her heals and damage spells are huge. It's satisfying to see your characters grow stronger, though it's true that the progression has obvious optimal paths. There is not much reason to say raise Elegos spirit, since he's mostly a physical attacker. So while you have freedom, it's not a system that leads you to widely divergent character builds. It's more about fine-tuning each character's speciality. The combat itself is classic turn-based strategy. You have your menu of actions, attacks, skills, items, etc., and you choose one each turn. There is an element of resource management. Most special skills consume action points. The game is pretty generous with AP restoring items, and characters like Idrial eventually get skills to regenerate AP or share it. But early on, you might find yourself running low in dungeon if you use too many skills on trash mobs. This encourages sometimes saving your big skills for tougher fights and using regular attacks on weaker foes. A few system adds flavor. Perfect mode. This is akin to a limit break or super move. As your party member deal and receive damage, a momentum meter fills up. When it's full, any character can trigger perfect mode, which lets you unleash a special attack. For example, one perfect attack summons an Ant to stomp all enemies, dealing heavy damage. It's a flashy trump card and can turn the tide in difficult battles. I remember using the Ant summon for the first time in a boss fight, and it was enormously satisfying to see these giant tree creatures smack the enemy for massive damage. It's a fun homage to the source material as well, basically letting you momentarily tap into the greater forces of Middle-earth. Later on though, you will unlock passive skills that give certain characters guaranteed critical strike when the perfect meter is full. And then it's more viable to just keep it filled at all time than using one powerful attack, making this mechanic practically useless. Evil mode. That was rather unique feature that I personally found neat. After you complete a chapter in the main game, you unlock that chapter scenario in evil mode from the main menu. In evil mode, you actually play as the enemies in a series of battles. For example, after finishing the Moria chapter, evil mode lets you control the Balrog and a bunch of orcs to fight against the good party, AI-controlled version of your heroes. If you manage to defeat your own characters, you earn special equipment or bonuses that carry back into the main game. Evil mode doesn't have a story. It's more like a challenge mode or a way to let players blow off steam by being the villains for a change. I remember altering between laughter and frustration, playing as a troll trying to squash my own team. It was a cool diversion and added replayability. It's also something you rarely see in RPGs, the chance to officially play the monsters. In context, it felt like the developers giving a little wink. We know you fight a lot of these enemies. Ever wondered what it's like to be on their side? Here, try it out. Now about the feel of combat. The Third Age battles are cinematic, but can be drawn out. Each attacker's skill has an animated sequence. For example, when Idrial casts a healing spell, she might raise her hand and a swirl of light envelops the party. When Hadhod uses his Earthshaker Slam, you see a mini cutscene of him jumping and smashing the ground with a shockwave. These look great for the first time and really bring some Peter Jackson style flair to each encounter. The camera might swoop around the Balrog as Beretor charges at it, or zoom in dramatically when an orc chieftain roars. However, the downside is long battle animations. In a lengthy dungeon with frequent random encounters, seeing the same elaborate attack animations repeatedly can become tedious. Modern gamers might instinctively look for a skip animation or fast forward button, but back in 2004 that wasn't common in console RPGs, and the Third Age certainly doesn't have it. On replay, I definitely felt some fatigue in areas like the endless plains of Rohan or the deep caves, where orc after orc would ambush with the Eye of Sauron icon flashing. The game indicates impeding random battles by how dark Sauron eye icon gets on the screen. A clever touch, but it doesn't reduce the encounter rate, it just warns you. Sometimes I just wanted to get to next story beat, but the game would throw a couple of orc fights at me, each consuming a few minutes due to animations. That said, I must applaud that the battles do require some tactical thinking, at least periodically. Especially the boss fights, those Barlock, Witch King, Mumakil encounters. They are not cakewalks if you don't use strategy. For example, the Balrog has a flame attack that can one-shot characters if you are low level, so you learn to use buffs to raise everyone fire resistance, or Idrial water-based attack which Balrog is weak to. In the fight against the Witch King, you can't just brute force him, you need to protect characters from fear effects. The game also likes to occasionally spawn very large groups of enemies in random battles, like 5 or 6 orcs at once, where if you're not paying attention, they could gang up and knock out a party member. Using area of effects attacks, or status effects like Elegos Sleep's arrows, can make a huge difference in those scenarios. Each character has an optimal use case. Idrial quickly became my cornerstone because she is the dedicated healer. She has a spell called Loud Water Fury, a water elemental attack that also deals good damage to fire-based enemies, and crucially, she learns Healing Waters, which is a party-wide heal over time spell that basically ensures your squad's survival in fights. Having Idrial in the party is almost mandatory for tough battles, which might be a balance issue, cause she's just so useful. Beretor is a strong physical attacker and tank. He can wear heavy armor and has high health. His leadership buffs, like Fellowship Grace, which regenerates everyone AP each turn, or Company Valor, which gives plus attack for the party, are extremely powerful when stacked. I found Beretor plus Idrial to be a combo that covers offense and defense nicely. Hadhot the Dwarf deals high damage. He's great for busting armored foes, and he's durable. I often used Hadhot as my third member for raw damage output and high health tank. Morwen is quite unique in that she dual wields axes and has very high speed. She can act often and has a steal item ability which can actually grab rare crafting items from enemies. Morwen's damage output can become very high if you invest in her strength and speed. She gets multi-hit combos that in late game can hit like a truck. I enjoyed swapping her in when I needed to deal with certain enemies quickly. She's more fragile than Beretor or Hadhot, but her agility compensates. Elegost excels at ranged attacks and status ailments. He can, for example, shoot arrows that stun or cause sleep, which is invaluable against some big monsters. He can also debuff enemies, lowering their accuracy or melee damage. I admit, in my first playthrough years ago, I underutilized Elegost because I focused on a brute force, but in my recent replay, I appreciated the crowd control he offers. Still, if you have fully buffed Beretor and fast Morwen, sometimes just killing things quicker is more efficient than stunning them, so Elegost can feed at that niche. Eoden the Rohirrim Knight has some overlapping skills with others. He's sort a second heavy hitter like Beretor, with spear attacks effective against mounted foes or spirits. He's useful in the Pelennor Fields segment, especially against the Mumakil or Ghosts. However, by the time you get him, late game, you might have a well-oiled team and he's coming in fresh. I did use him a bit, but my attachment was more to the characters I leveled up from early on. During my playthrough, I naturally gravitated toward a favorite party composition. In my case, it was usually Idrial, Hadhot, and Morwen once all were available. Idrial kept us healed and could nuke with spells. Hadhot provided massive damage and could take a hits, and Morwen quick strikes could eliminate pesky enemies or take advantage of enemy weaknesses. Plus, she often got the first turn due to her speed, which is great for using items or interrupting an enemy. Beretor I would swap in for specific fights, especially where leadership buffs made a difference. Elegost come in handy for a few boss fights where stun worked. Essentially, the game allows you to tailor the party to your liking, which I appreciate. You're not forced to use the main character Beretor all the time. I liked experimenting with who worked best against what. However, one thing to note, because you can swap characters freely and everyone shares in experience, even benched members get a little and you can swap them in to tag some actions to keep them leveled. By endgame it's possible to have an overpowered party across the board. In my recent run, by the time I reached the final stretch, all 6 of my characters were pretty buff. I could mix and match at will and still steamroll most encounters. The game difficulty is generally not very high if you fight most of the random battles and level up steadily. Critics at the time pointed out that EA likely made the game on the easier, more accessible side, probably to not scare away Lord of the Rings fans who might not typically play RPGs. As the result, hardcore RPGs player might find it too easy or shallow in terms of challenge. There are a few spikes. The Balrog fight can be tough if you come underprepared, but overall, the balance leans toward letting the player feel like a hero rather than constantly struggling. The random encounters frequency is something I should touch on. The Third Age has random battles in exploration areas, indicated by the little Eye of Sauron icon growing darker as you risk an encounter. In practical terms, if you're moving through, say, Eastern Moria tunnels, expect to fight a group of goblins or orcs every so many steps. The encounter rate is neither extremely high nor low. I would call it moderate but noticeable. If you are someone who dislikes frequent interruptions, this could annoy you. There is no item to reduce encounters, but if you really want to avoid fights, you could run from battles. The fact that battles are visually interesting and tactically engaging mitigates the annoyance somewhat. It's not boring to fight, it can just feel repetitive after a while because the enemy variety per area is limited. There is also the equipment system. As an RPG, you collect and equip weapons, armors, and accessories. One of joys in Third Age is that every time you get a new piece of gear, it actually changes the character's appearance. The visual detail is great. New swords look distinct, new armors gives your heroes a whole new outfit often. For example, Beretor starts in basic Gondor soldier gear, but by the end you might find him clad in ornate plate with a swan motif shield, akin to Dol Amroth style. Idrial might swap her Lothlorien gown for a Rivendell style armor if you find one. These changes keep the looks fresh and serve as visual progression indicator. Stat-wise, gear mostly just increase attributes. There are also elf stones that you can equip to give any character new abilities. For example, Lightcraft for light spells, Shadowcraft for dark spells, item crafting stones, etc. These are interesting because they let you customize a bit. You could give Beretor some healing spells via Elfstone, or give Idrial a Shadowcraft stone to cast offensive dark magic. It's a fun way to tweak rolls, but I'll admit I didn't use them extensively aside from giving someone the craft item ability. The reason is the core characters already cover most needs, and often the Elfstone abilities come late or are underpowered compared to what your specialist can do. Still, it's a nice optional layer for those who want to min-max or just play around with magic combos. Now, did the gameplay hold up for me in 2025? Surprisingly yes, with some caveats. The core combat system, being borrowed from such a solid template, Final Fantasy X, it's still enjoyable and strategic. There is a timeless quality to turn-based battles done well, and the Third Age does them well. It's satisfying to plan out moves, use the turn order to your advantage, and see your party synergize. When I slowed a boss with Elegos shot and then buffed my team speed with Idrial, I effectively got several extra turns in before the boss could act. That gave a gratifying sense of outsmarting the enemy. Or discovering that a troll was vulnerable to Hot stun effect, allowing me to lock it down, felt rewarding. Those small tactical victories add up to a feeling that you are not just a button mashing, you are actively figuring out the best approach each battle. At least until you get so strong that any approach works. The tedium factor does creep in the random fights and their animation length. On modern hardware via emulator, there was an option to increase the emulation speed. I confess I toggled that a few times in very grindy stretches, essentially making the battles play out at 1.5 speed. Of course, on an actual PS2 you wouldn't have that luxury, so patience is needed if you want to not run from too many fights. In terms of game length, the Third Age is not as long as many JRPGs. I would say it's around 25 to 30 hours if you do a fair number of side quests and evil mode. That's actually relatively brisk for a multi-chapter RPG, covering 3 films worth of content. The reason it doesn't overstay its welcome is that they streamlined and trimmed a lot of the travel fluff. You essentially jump from one meaningful location to the next without huge overworld section in between. I think the length is fine, enough to feel epic, but not so much that the repetition becomes unbearable. Some reviewers back then called it an entry-level RPG that's a bit shallow, which I interpret as saying it's simpler, shorter RPG experience compared to others. That's fair, but again, if you come for Lord of the Rings, you will likely enjoy it for thematic content, not because it reinvents RPG mechanics or offers extreme depth. Finally, the gameplay has some cool memorable moments that merge mechanics with story. For example, at Helm's Deep there is a segment where you're essentially in a gauntlet battle. Waves of enemies keep coming, and the tension of that siege is represented by multiple back-to-back fights. It actually tests your resource management, because your health and AP carry over in fights chain without a break. It made me feel the stress of holding the wall as wave after wave came. Another instance is the fight alongside Gandalf in Moria. Gandalf is a temporary Forge party member just for that Balrog battle, and having him in combat is a blast. He's got powerful spells and even a unique ability to replenish the party action points. Mechanically, it was a treat because you suddenly had this overpowered friend and you wanted to maximize what he could do before the fight ended. It's little things like this which blend the gameplay and the Lord of the Rings flavor together. So to wrap up gameplay section, the Third Age offers a classic turn-based RPG experience with a Middle-earth skin, and it executes this solidly. It's not without flaws, there is some grind, some repetition, and it certainly doesn't push the genre forward. But it delivers on the fun factor of developing a team of heroes, strategizing in battles, and getting steadily stronger as you move from one epic confrontation to the next. The phrase, the most exciting RPG since Final Fantasy, was even boldly printed on the game's cover back in the day. A bit of marketing hyperbole perhaps. While I wouldn't rank it up with the all-time great RPGs, I will say that if you enjoy the general gameplay of Final Fantasy X or similar titles, the Third Age scratches that itch in a satisfying way, all while draping everything the sights and sound of Lord of the Rings, which for fans is a huge plus. Now that we covered how the game plays, let's talk about how it looks and sounds. Because one reason those battles remain engaging is the presentation. The visuals and audio that accompany every swing of the sword or every trek across Middle-earth. The Third Age was often praised for its production values, so let's delve into that. One of the strongest impressions the Third Age made in 2004 was its visual presentation. At the time, many reviewers and players were wowed by how closely the game graphics and art direction matched the look of the Peter Jackson films. Playing it again now, with the benefit of HD upscaling, I was struck by how moody and cinematic the game still feels. For a PS2 era title, the Third Age pushed some boundaries. The character models of the main cast are detailed, with flowing cloaks, glinting armor, and even facial expressions, although extremely limited. But the real star is the environmental design. The developers at EA Redwood Shores clearly studied Weta Workshop's film set closely. Moria in the game is dark, vast, and eerie. You see the looming pillars of the Dwarrow Delph and hear distant cracks and drums. When your party steps into Balin's tomb, the layout and details are spot on. It was like walking into the movie scene itself. Similarly, Helm's Deep is rendered with care. The dipping wall, the keep, even the culvert that gets blown up by Saruman explosive. It's all there as your battle arena. Minas Tirith courtyard and streets appear appropriately grand. Though you don't see entire city, the segments you fight in capture the white stone architecture and sense of siege. There is a part where you fight on the top levels of Minas Tirith, and Denethor, on fire, ran past and hurled himself off the edge. And the game handles that in-engine, which was both morbidly funny and impressive that they included it. The game uses a lot of dynamic lighting and particle effects that added to the atmosphere. In the dim halls of Moria, torches cast flickering lights, and every time someone casts a spell, shadow dance on the wall. In combat, if an enemy is wielding flame, the area gets a warm glow. I noticed especially in the Mount Doom, Barad-dûr area near the end, the screen takes on this fiery orange tint, and there are ashes drifting in the air, really selling that you are in a hellscape of Mordor. These touches go a long way toward immersion. One minor downside of the visual, which is just a reality of the era, is the linearity of environments. Most areas are designed as paths and corridors. Beautifully decorated corridors, but corridors nonetheless. You can't, for example, wander off the road. You go along the set route with invisible walls beyond the edges. The benefit is that designers could highly detail that road and control the vistas you see. The downside is that you don't have open exploration like some modern games. This wasn't a big issue to me. I actually appreciated the focused design because it meant the visuals were concentrated for impact rather than diluted over an open world. But it's worth noting if someone expects large sandbox zones. It's more akin to a guided tour as we mentioned earlier. One aspect of visual is the enemy designs. They were directly influenced by Weta designs from the films as well. So you have Moria goblins looking just as they did in the movie. The Uruk-hai with their white hand emblems, the Haradrim on their Mumakil with vibrant crimson and gold armor. The Balrog in the game looks phenomenal. It's basically the movie Balrog, complete with flowing fire mane and smoke. The Witch King, in his armored form, riding a fell beast, appear just like in the Return of the King Pelennor scene. And the Eye of Sauron? Well, it's a giant flaming eye, but they made it into something like a boss entity so you can target and hit, which is visually tricky to convey. The game shows it as flaming iris that flares and projects shadowy forms at you. I found it both funny and cool as mentioned. It's not every day you fight an eye, and the art team did their best to make that dramatic. Now on to audio, which for a Lord of the Ring based game is hugely important. The Third Age uses the official film score by Howard Shore, and this is a massive boost to the game atmosphere. There is nothing quite like hearing those familiar musical themes swell up while you're playing. For instance, during the Eregion part, you get the hints of the Shire theme. Though you never go to the Shire, the music carries that early Fellowship feel. In Moria, the scorn turns ominous and you hear the Khazad-dûm bridge music when fighting with Balrog. In Rohan, the string motif that defines the Rohan theme plays as you roam the plains. And in Gondor, you will catch the Gondor theme and the Minas Tirith trumpet calls. The usage isn't always one-to-one with the film scenes, but it's done effectively. Because EA had the rights to the film assets, they could integrate these soundtracks seamlessly. This is something that games like The Two Towers and The Return of the King, the action games, also did, and it makes a world of difference. The music alone can give you chills. For example, after you defeat the Witch King with Eowyn, the game cued the triumphant victory music from that film moment, giving you an extra emotional payoff. The battle music in normal encounters is actually one of the few original or less known pieces. Those were serviceable, but whenever a major track from the films kicked in, it definitely elevated the experience. Now, onto voice acting. This one is a mixed bag in the Third Age. On one hand, we have the aforementioned Sir Ian McKellen providing narration as Gandalf for the epic scenes, and Christopher Lee voicing Saruman in a few segments, like when Beretor has vision of Saruman taunting him. Having these two reprising their roles is absolutely wonderful. McKellen's narration gives gravitas and consistency. It genuinely feels like Gandalf is guiding you, and his voice lends credibility to the game's story. For example, when you find a new epic scene, you might hear Gandalf say, "Behold the long abandoned halls of Moria, where darkness dwells," in that wise, grave tone. It sends tingles down your spine if you are a fan. Christopher Lee's deep, ominous voice appears in some dreamlike sequences to represent Beretor's internal struggle, Saruman trying to influence him. And it's great to hear even if those scenes are brief. The film character lines during combat or cutscenes are sometimes lifted directly from the movies. For instance, when Legolas shows up in Helm's Deep, I think he just uses some movie lines like "the armor is weak on the neck." Aragorn might shout "to the gate" or other rallying cries that we know. This is both cool and occasionally a little awkward. It's cool because it ties things to the film tightly. It's awkward because sometimes the light might not 100% fit the context, or the audio quality or delivery might contrast with the newly recorded lines. Also, these heroes aren't around long, so you usually get a couple of such lines. As for the voices of the original characters, these would have been done by the voice actors hired for the game. I found them generally competent. Idrial has a soft, ethereal quality to her voice which suits her elf nature. Beretor is appropriately stoic and valiant sounding. Morwen has a bit of determined fierceness in her tone. Elegost is gruff and quiet. And Hathot, the dwarf, is voiced with this deep, hearty, kind of Scottish accented inflection, the standard fantasy dwarf style. He often gets the more humorous or light-hearted lines, grumbling about elf magic or boasting after a win. His delivery and timing gave the character some charm and personality beyond the archetype. I honestly think the reason Hathot stands out is because he injects a bit of levity and bravado in otherwise very earnest group. However, not everything is perfect in the voice department. Some of the dialogue recordings for the original characters, and even McKellen narration at times, have a slightly tinny or hollow sound, as they were recorded in a big empty room or with a less advanced equipment. It's noticeable if you have a keen ear. The difference in acoustic quality between, say, Gandalf movie lines, ripped straight from the film audio, and Gandalf's newly recorded narration can sometimes be discerned. The latter might have a bit of echo or less richness. It's not immersion breaking, but some players might catch it. Also, because the game heavily relies on narration and less on direct interaction with NPCs, there are virtually no traditional LPC conversations since your party is mostly alone in their journey. The voice acting we hear is mostly battle shouts or narrated exposition. The script the actors were given is serviceable but not exceptional. Don't expect any Shakespearean monologues or deep emotional exchanges between the original characters. They mostly talk strategy or react to what's happening, like, we must reach the gates of Minas Tirith quickly, that kind of thing. They do what's needed to keep the plot moving, but the heart of the dialogue is really in Gandalf's epic narrations or film derived speeches. Another minor aspect, enemy voices. They often use film samples. The orcs sound like the orcs from the movies, and the Nazgul screeches are on point. The Balrog doesn't speak, of course, but its roar is straight out from Fellowship. These go a long way in making battles feel authentic. Now, outside the technicalities, how do the visual and audio come together in terms of atmosphere? In my opinion, the game nails the Middle-earth atmosphere about as well as any adaptation I've seen. The combination of those sweeping visuals and Shore's music triggers a strong sense of place and emotion. There were times I would stop moving the character just to listen to the music and look around. The game is linear, yes, but it looks as the world is expansive around you. They often put great painted backdrops or skyboxes, like distant mountains or armies clashing far away, to sell the scale. The cinematic angles and cutscenes within the game engine are also well directed. They often mimic the film's style. The game even attempts a few of its own cinematic moments. For example, after you defeat the Balrog, there is a slow-mo of Gandalf delivering famous "You shall not pass" line. Or when the Helm's Deep is overrun and Aragorn calls a retreat, you see your party covering the escape of villagers, giving a sense of urgency and heroism to your role. These are directed with the same kind of sweeping camera moves and dramatic scoring as the movies, just in real-time engine graphics. All in all, the visuals and audio work in tandem to capture that Lord of the Rings feeling. Is it as breathtaking now as it was in 2004? Perhaps not purely in technical terms, but artistically I would say it aged well. With just a little help from modern enhancements, it can actually look quite impressive. And the audio, especially the soundtrack, is timeless. Hearing those compositions never fails to stir something in a fan's heart. It's no surprise that even critics who were lukewarm on the gameplay still praise the Third Age presentation. IGN's review called it one of the best looking Tolkien games. I agree. They may have played it safe with gameplay innovation, but they did not slack off in bringing the Middle-earth to life on the screen. In a way, the games sometimes feel like an interactive extension of the films, which is probably exactly what they intended. With the sights and sound covered, we can transition into discussing the broader themes and atmosphere of the game, the kind of intangible qualities that linger after you put the controller down. Because beyond graphic and sound, the Third Age tries to evoke the same themes of hope, friendship, and struggle against darkness that the source material is known for. It's worth analyzing how well it does that, and also pointing out those moments where maybe the game's need for constant battles jars with the narrative tone. Threading through the Third Age, one can't help but notice that the game leans heavily into the same themes of fate, hope, war, and darkness that permeate Tolkien's work and Jackson's film adaptations. The developers clearly wanted the game to carry an emotional weight similar to the movies, even if the story was a side variation. Let's talk about how those themes come across and how the overall atmosphere makes you feel as you play. One major theme I felt was duty and fate. Your party essentially exists to serve the greater good without ever being in the spotlight. There is a kind of nobility in that concept. Gandalf's guidance presented almost as if your characters were meant to be where they are, playing backup to Fellowship as part of a larger design. Gandalf, through narration, often reassures Beretor that what they do matters for the war's outcome, even if they won't get songs sung about them. That ties into the classic Tolkien theme. that even the humblest person or unexpected helper can contribute to the great events of their time. Now, Beretor isn't exactly humble background folk. He's a trained warrior, but relative to Aragorn or Frodo, he's not a chosen one. There is an interesting psychological aspect to this. At the start, Beretor is just trying to catch up to Boromir, presumably to help or prove himself. By the end, he's helped save Middle-earth in a dozen unseen ways, and nobody in Minas Tirith even knows. It's kind of poignant if you think about it. The game doesn't deeply explore the character's inner feelings about this, but I projected a bit. I imagined Beretor coming to terms with being okay not getting glory because he fought for what was right. The atmosphere, especially in the final stages, has that melancholic triumph to it. After you defeat Sauron's eye and the ring is destroyed, there is a sense of we did our part and that's enough. The music is triumphant, but there is also a somber quality, possibly because we, the players, know that the main heroes elsewhere are the ones celebrated. The theme of always one step behind the Fellowship defines the game's perspective. Atmospherically, this lends to a constant feeling of chasing or just missing something crucial. It creates a slightly bittersweet mood. For example, in Moria, you literally are steps behind Fellowship. You arrive at Balin's tomb after they left it, you catch up to Gandalf at the dramatic moment, but then he falls. There is a part in the film where the Fellowship leaves Lothlorien and Celeborn says, I've sent messengers to gather others to protect the borders, but we are stretched thin. I like to think Idrial was one of those messengers, rushing to catch up. These near misses are all over. Atmosphere-wise, it gives the journey a feeling of melancholy at times. Your heroes don't get to bask in the victory moments of the war, they often see the aftermath or the devastation. They follow in Fellowship wake, witnessing the destruction that the enemy left, or arriving at battles that have already been fought, or are just about to erupt. Yet, on the flip side, whenever they do catch up in time to help in battle, like Barlog, Helm's Deep, Pelennor, it feels like a vindication, almost as if fate allowed them to be present at some pivotal moments, even if from the shadows. The atmosphere in those battles is stirring. I recall at Helm's Deep, when the sun rises and the Gandalf and Eomer arrive, the game actually doesn't show them because that's beyond your area, but the effect on the battle is felt. The tide turns, enemies waver. You, as the player party, feel like we held out long enough for the plan to work. There is a satisfaction in that, a theme of perseverance. The game also emphasized the theme of unity against darkness. Your party is motley crew. Elf, Dwarf, Gondorian, two Rohirrim, Ranger. They mirror a fellowship diversity and the idea that different people of Middle-earth must cooperate. Early in the game, Hadhod, the dwarf, and Idrial, the elf, trade some barbs. It's a nod to a Legolas and Gimli initial wariness, but they grow to trust each other. The game doesn't give us lengthy scenes of bonding, but through combat barks and little cutscenes, you sense camaraderie building. By the end, Beretor called them friends. This again parallels the fellowship vibe. Individuals overcoming traditional enmities. Elf versus Dwarf, Gondor versus Rohan, for a common cause. It's simple but effective in tone. The game's mood is predominantly serious, war-torn and somber, matching the latter parts of Lord of the Rings more than the light-hearted Shire beginning, since we start in the thick of danger with Nazgul attacks and never have a peaceful Hobbit party kind of chapter. Traveling through these battlefields and ruins, you feel the weight of war. The music, as discussed, reinforces that, often somber and epic. The idea of shadow versus light is showed visually and in narration. Gandalf often speaks of the shadow spreading from Mordor and how the characters must hold back the darkness. The environments go from the bright green fields early on to the dark plains of Mordor by the end, representing that journey deeper into the enemy's territory, literally walking into shadow. One theme the game inherits by virtue of being Lord of the Rings is hope in the face of despair. In many battles, things look bad. The party is outnumbered, cities are in flames, etc. But either through a turn of the tide or sheer determination, the heroes prevail. Because we know how Lord of the Ring ends, we have that meta-knowledge of hope. We know that as long as Frodo is out there, there is hope. The game leverages that, by occasionally reminding us through narration of Frodo's quest. There is a very atmospheric epic scene you can unlock in Mordor where Gandalf narrates some struggle with Shelob and the light of Erendil, the Phial of Galadriel, pushing back the darkness in the tunnel. As a player, hearing that while you're literally in Mordor fighting Sauron's hordes is inspiring. The synergy of knowing the parallel stories adds a layer of thematic depth to what would otherwise be just another monster fight. Now, on the question of absurd or immersion breaking moments. They do exist, and they sort of clash with the intended atmosphere. The prime example, fighting alongside Gandalf against the Balrog. Don't get me wrong, it's cool, but when you step back, it's like, so three random warriors helped Gandalf beat the Balrog? It's a divergence from the solemn narrative of the film, where it's a self-sacrificial one-on-one. The game tries to keep the gravity by showing Gandalf fall and the music, but you can't shake that you, as a player, were whacking Durin's Bane with a sword, which is a bit fan-fictiony. Same with Eowyn versus Witch King fight. That moment in the story is so iconic for her character, it's supposed to be her triumph and tragedy. In the game, your party is present, possibly diminishing that a bit. They handle it by letting Eowyn strike the final blow in the cutscene, but still, your participation is a little lore awkward. However, I will say while playing, I was excited to be there. And of course, the Eye of Sauron boss battle. Tonally, that's both the most absurd and strangely cathartic part. Absurd, because it completely breaks lore. Nobody climbs Barad-dûr to duel Sauron's eye. But cathartic, because after hours of fighting minions, you get to symbolically pummel the ultimate evil. The game's atmosphere at that point becomes almost surreal. The sky is black and red, the tower top is crumbling, and this giant flaming eye is gazing at you. It felt like a dream sequence or some mythic allegory, like you are fighting the concept of Sauron's will. They underscore it with epic music and dire sound design. Once you defeat it, it isn't like you killed Sauron, the ring destruction off screen does that, but the tower starts collapsing, implying your battle was happening concurrently with the ring being destroyed. The game basically shows Barad-dûr collapsing and the eagles coming, maybe implying the eagles snatch your team to safety. It's never directly shown, but presumably they didn't intend your heroes to die in collapse. The lack of explanation for how your party got there and survived is definitely immersion breaking. It's a pure rule of cool moment. They wanted a final boss, so there is it. Thematically, if I stretch, I can say it symbolizes your party confronting the very embodiment of shadow with steadfast courage, a final trial of their faith and strength. But realistically, it's just a gamey element. I didn't mind it, but a lore purist would roll their eyes. Overall, the atmosphere remains consistent with the tone of Lord of the Rings most of the time. Earnest, somber, occasionally hopeful, with a sense of rising tension as you go deeper into danger. The small parts where things get goofy or break immersion are short-lived. The main narrative tries to maintain dignity. By the end of the Third Age, I felt a sense of nostalgic fulfillment. The atmosphere had successfully made me feel like I would journey through the trials of Lord of the Rings again, although from a different perspective. There is a final narrated epilogue thanking the player for their efforts in ensuring victory. It felt a bit like the characters acknowledged their fate as the unsung heroes. There was also a bittersweet note, like now the war is over, what becomes of them? The game doesn't say any of it explicitly, but the atmosphere of the ending made me satisfied. That reflective, almost melancholic aftertaste is very Tolkien in spirit. After the great deeds, the Age of Heroes ends and things quietly reset. In conclusion, the Third Age does a commendable job channeling the spirit of Lord of the Rings narrative, themes and emotional tone, especially considering it has to juggle being an exciting game too. When it errs on the side of giving players a fun experience rather than preserving strict lore consistency. But at its best moments, you genuinely feel the gravity of War of the Ring, the camaraderie of the Fellowship, and the triumph of hope over despair. Not many licensed games manage to capture that as well as this one did. Now, having dissected the game from its creation to its mechanics and storytelling, it's time to step back and see how it was received in its own time and what kind of legacy, if any, it left behind. This will give a context to how the Third Age is viewed today, including by me revisiting it. Let's dive into the next section. When The Lord of the Rings The Third Age released in late 2004, it landed to somewhat mixed reviews from critics and somewhat polarized opinions from players. It's interesting to look back on it now, because over time it became a bit of a cult favorite among certain fans, especially Lord of the Rings fans who have nostalgia for it, even as it remains relatively obscure to the wider gaming community. Most reviewers praised the game presentation. The graphics, music, and a faithful Middle-earth atmosphere got a lot of thumbs up. For example, GameSpot gave it 7.7 out of 10, highlighting the excellent visuals and cinematic feel, but dinging it for shallow story and repetitive gameplay. IGN was actually more generous, scoring it 8.5 out of 10. They lauded how beautifully Middle-earth was rendered and how accessible the gameplay was, though even they noted the characters were basically archetypes and some RPG mechanics were very streamlined. Eurogamer and others were more critical, some calling it a bit derivative, the Final Fantasy X combat clone aspect, and an entry-level RPG that might not satisfy genre veterans. One reviewer said, "I don't care about the characters. I felt like I was given the minor league version of the Fellowship." Yet, in the same breath, admitted it was a phenomenal recreation of Middle-earth. That pretty much sums it up. If you were a Lord of the Rings fan, you could overlook a lot and just enjoy being in the world. If you were coming for a deep RPG or original story, you might be underwhelmed. One criticism that popped up was the repetition in gameplay, particularly the combat. Some found the random battles and rather linear skill progression to become boring after a while. Phrases like too shallow or simplistic were used. However, others argued that the straightforward nature made it great my first RPG for people who maybe got into gaming through the Lord of the Rings movies and hadn't played a lot of turn-based games before. It's worth noting that in 2004, Western console RPGs were relatively rare. Most were Japanese developed. EA, doing a JRPG style game, was itself novel. Some traditional RPG fans maybe looked at it as EA is trying to copy a formula without a nuance. Hence the mild disappointment in some reviews that it didn't match the depth of, say, Final Fantasy in storytelling or innovation. Regarding commercial performance, EA reported that the Third Age sold over 1 million copies worldwide by the end of 2004. It's a solid number, though in perspective, the Two Towers and Return of the King action games each sold a few million. Also, in late 2004, a million copies would be considered a success, but not a blockbuster by EA standards, especially across 3 platforms. It likely made a decent profit, but perhaps not enough to consider it a breakout hit requiring a sequel. Additionally, by 2005, the Lord of the Rings fervor was cooling a bit since the films were done, and EA might have been shifting priorities. One anecdotal factor, possibly affecting its mainstream awareness, it launched the same week as Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. GTA was a huge cultural gaming moment that probably overshadowed many other releases. So outside of the Lord of the Rings fan community, the Third Age kind of slipped under the radar for a lot of gamers. Among Lord of the Rings fans, especially younger ones at the time, like I was, the Third Age was often received more warmly than by critics. We didn't mind that Beretor was basically a discount Aragorn, or that the story was a fan fiction-y. We loved that we got to explore Middle-earth more and have our own adventure. I recall online forums and even Reddit discussions later where people call it one of their favorite Lord of the Ring games, albeit acknowledging it's great and bad at the same time. However, outside the Lord of the Rings community, the game didn't leave a huge footprint. It wasn't the kind of RPG that enthusiasts would hold up as a classic of that era, compared to, say, Knights of the Old Republic on Xbox or Final Fantasy X on PS2. So its reputation is very much tied to one interest in the franchise. EA produced several Lord of the Rings games in early 2000s. The slasher ones, Two Towers and Return of the King, were popular and generally better remembered due to being directly tied to the movies. There were also Battle for Middle-earth RTS games on PC. The Third Age kind of occupies a niche corner, not as commonly discussed as the above, but those who played it often remembered it fondly. A lot of folks might not even know it exists. They know the action games and maybe the later LEGO Lord of the Rings or Shadow of Mordor, but not this turn-based oddity. Thus the tagline, "the best Lord of the Rings game you never heard of," makes sense. The Third Age did not get a sequel. In concept, they could have tried an original Fourth Age story, or adapted The Hobbit or something in similar RPG style, but it never happened. Partly this might be because EA rights were specifically to the films, which after Return of the King didn't have a new content to adapt, and the license eventually shifted. Also, Redwood Shores pivoted to other projects. It seemed the Third Age was a one-time experiment during the Lord of the Rings craze, and once that window closed, EA moved on. Another factor, by 2006, the rights for Lord of the Rings games expanded to Warner Bros., who co-published the Battle of Middle-earth 2 with EA, and later took the license fully for games like War in the North and Shadow of Mordor. So even if EA wanted to do more, the legal situation might have changed. The result is the Third Age remains unique. No direct follow-up, and even within Lord of the Rings games, none other is turn-based party RPG. It's one of its kind. In terms of legacy, the Third Age might have not influenced the industry or spawned a series, but it left imprints on fans. Many who played it back then carry a torch for it. On forums, you will occasionally see threads like, "Do you remember the Third Age? This game was awesome," followed by nostalgia discussions. It's often praised for filling a fantasy many had. What if we could have a Final Fantasy game set in the Middle-earth? It delivered on that, even if imperfectly. For those of us replaying it now, with modern sensibilities, it's easy to spot its flaws, but there is also a strong nostalgia factor that can't be denied. I found that many of the criticism I could level at the game academically didn't dampen my enjoyment much, largely because of my love for the setting and my memories associated with it. And I suspect that's a common feeling. If you remove the Lord of the Rings skin and imagine the exact same gameplay in a generic fantasy world with generic music, would it have been well liked? Probably not. It might have been seen as a mediocre RPG. But with the Lord of the Rings license, it becomes more than a sum of its parts for fans. Conversely, a hardcore RPG gamer who isn't into Lord of the Rings likely found it middling. It's really one of those games whose appreciation hinges on how much you value the theme setting versus the mechanics. On a personal note, this game left enough of a mark that all these years later, I felt compelled to revisit it and make this deep dive video about it. That speaks to its impact on me. I suspect there are many like me who, when they think of the PS2 era, the Third Age comes to mind as that unique journey through Middle-earth we got to take. So what's the legacy? It's a bit of a hidden treasure in Lord of the Rings gaming catalog, and one of that, despite its flaws, delivered a memorable experience. It demonstrated that a turn-based RPG in popular franchise could find an audience. In some ways, I wonder if it even paved a tiny path for other franchise RPG spin-offs. Like later we saw South Park The Stick of Truth doing a turn-based RPG in a different IP. Different context, but the idea of taking a beloved IP and making a classic RPG out of it is something that Third Age did early on. Finally, let's answer. Is it worth playing in 2025? From my perspective, for fans of that era of gaming or fans of Lord of the Rings, absolutely yes. It's a genuinely fun ride if you know what you're getting into. For others, if someone has zero attachment to Lord of the Rings and is used to modern open world RPGs, they might find it dated or not engaging. But if one goes in with appreciation for early 2000s design and a love for Middle-earth, there is a lot to enjoy. I would encourage anyone who falls into that category to give it a shot. Replaying the Third Age after so many years has been a bit like meeting with an old friend. There is that comforting familiarity. The music cues that instantly transported me back to sitting on the carpet in my friend's house, PS2 controller in hand, eyes wide at the Balrog appearing on the screen. And there is also the realization of how both the game and I have changed, or not changed, over time. On a nostalgic level, this game's value to me is huge. I grew up during the era when the Lord of the Rings films were coming out, and I was utterly enchanted by Middle Earth. The Third Age came at the right time. It let me extend that adventure in a new way. Playing it now in 2025, I still felt that childlike excitement at hearing the battle cries of orcs or seeing the party stand off against the troll. Despite knowing the outcomes and having more critical acumen now, I was able to slip back into the mindset of just being a fan on an adventure. That's the magic of nostalgia. It can smooth over the rough edges. Every time the game's flaws peek through, like repetitive fights or cheesy dialogue, I also remembered how I didn't care about these things when I first played. And honestly, they didn't bother me much now either, because I was viewing it through a warm, fuzzy lens of fond memory. However, experiencing it with fresh eyes also let me appreciate some things more deeply. For instance, I have a greater appreciation now for how the game leveraged the film license. I can recognize the cleverness of integrating extended edition scenes or the effort in matching the art design, things I took for granted as a kid. I also noticed the soundtrack implementation more. In a way, I enjoyed it on a new analytical level, which layered on top of emotional enjoyment. Speaking to the game's flaws, yes, they are there. The story is basically fan service, the gameplay can be grindy, and it definitely feels dated in some mechanics. I wouldn't argue with someone who bounces off it today for those reasons. But I think if you approach it with the right expectations, its strength overshadows those issues. Its strength is that it delivers a satisfying journey through Middle-earth that hits all the high points a fan would want, and does so with genuine reverence for the source material. The final act of my replay, when I was fighting at Pelennor and then the Blackgate Barad-dûr, I was surprised how emotionally invested I still was. Even though I knew, for example, that Frodo would success and all would end well, the game had made me care about my little knockoff fellowship and I wanted to see them go through safely. When the Eye of Sauron fell and peace returned, I actually felt a little emotional. Part relief at finishing the game, part actual sentiment for Middle-earth's salvation. Any game that can stir that kind of feeling years later is doing something right at a core level. Replaying the Third Age was a beautiful, flawed, but meaningful experience. It reminded me how far games have come, but also how some feelings you get from games are timeless. This replay also stirred up thoughts about revisiting all games in general. It's fascinating how games can change for us over time, even though the code on the disc remains the same. We bring new experiences, new expectations, and even a bit of anxiety. Will this be as good as I remember? Sometimes you're disappointed, but other times you discover new layers, or at least new appreciation. In this case, it was the latter. It made me reflect on how we change. As a kid, I might have skipped cutscenes to get to the action. Now, I cherish those cutscenes and find myself pondering their place in the lore. I also realized that revisiting old games is not just about the game itself, but about recapturing feelings and seeing how they resonate now. There is a line in The Lord of the Rings about how characters can't return to the way things were. Time has passed, they've changed. In a small way, that's true for revisiting any beloved piece of media. I didn't feel exactly as I did in 2004. I felt something slightly different, a mix of nostalgia and new insight. And that's wonderful in its own way. It's like when you reread The Lord of the Rings at different ages. Each time you take away something different, but the story is the same. As I wrap up this deep dive, I want to say a personal thank you. Thank you to you, the viewer, for coming along on this journey with me. Both the journey through the game and the journey through my memories. It's been quite intimate sharing these reflections, and I hoped if you played the Third Age before, this brought back some memories for you too. In the end, the Third Age might not be the greatest RPG ever or the most innovative Lord of the Rings game, but it has a heart. It allowed us to walk into the footsteps of legend and for a little while believe that we were heroes in the Middle Earth. For me, that's a feeling worth revisiting and cherishing. Thank you for watching and listening to this long reflection. It means a lot that you came along on this nostalgic adventure with me. Until our next journey,